Then welcome everybody to this afternoon or this evening, depending upon where you are, and our session for the Oxford Interfaith Forum, in which today we will hear about the wonderful painting, The Light of the World, by that wonderful Pre-Raphaelite painter, Holman Hunt, done in the mid-19th century, and the question of whether it is an imperialist icon or universal symbol. My name is Orezi Salties. I teach at Georgetown University here in Washington, D.C. That's where I am. And I teach religion and theology, and I teach art history, and I teach philosophy and politics. It's my pleasure to act as host and to introduce our speaker, who is the Reverend Canon Dr. Joanna Collicutt, who is a member of the Faculty of Theology and Religion at the University of Oxford, as well as an associate lecturer at Ripon College, Cuddesdon, and an associate priest in an Oxfordshire parish. Joanna Collicutt studied experimental psychology and after that theology at Oxford University, as well as clinical psychology and then Christianity and the arts at King's College London, where she is still at the moment pursuing her doctoral studies. After many years working in the National Health Service as a clinical neuropsychologist, Dr. Collicutt moved into the field of psychology of religion as director of the MA program in psychology of religion at Haythrop College, University of London. From 2010 to 2020, she was the Carl Jaspers Lecturer in Psychology and Spirituality at Ripon College, Cuddesdon, and Oxford Diocesan Older People's Advisor. She's chartered psychologist and fellow of the British Psychological Society and also a Canon of Christ Church Cathedral. Joanna is the author of many academic papers, and recent books include The Psychology of Christian Character Formation, Being Mindful, Being Christian, Thinking of You, a Theological and Practical Resource for the Spiritual Care of People with Dementia, When You Pray, Seriously Messy, Neurology and Religion, and So Longeth My Soul, a Christian Spiritual Reader, which is forthcoming. So she's quite accomplished, and we are all enormously intrigued to hear her commentary on this painting by Holman Hunt and its implications for her subject. So Dr. Collicutt, the floor is yours. Let me just add one thing, which is I assume everyone is muted, and please stay muted until the Q&A, which will follow after Dr. Collicutt is finished, and then I will field your questions. And yeah, that's it for the moment. So take it away, Joanna.
Thank you. Thank you for such a warm welcome and for the invitation, which was at first enticing, but on reflection challenging, because it's hard to know how to talk about art in an interfaith context. And I've decided to talk about this 19th century Pre-Raphaelite work that means a lot to me. It's very well known, but it's almost equally disliked these days, and it's often been parodied. I've chosen it because it expresses interfaith themes. It attempts a form of interfaith engagement, and it was painted in a context of massive social, cultural, and intellectual change, where manifold new and different meta-narratives were being discovered and incorporated into the political power games of those times. I'm going to try and share my screen now, hopefully successfully. So the painting, which I'm going to talk about, is very dense with detail, and I won't be able to cover all of the details or all of their implications in this talk, but I hope nevertheless it will indicate some interesting avenues and give a sense of the richness and generativity of the work. And the question that I've posed in the title is a genuine question. I'm not sure of the answer myself, though I will suggest some tentative conclusions. So first of all, some biographical details about the painter. So William Holman Hunt was born at Cheapside in the City of London to a family who for generations had been fervent evangelical Christians. Hunt's father was a warehouse manager and he wanted him to enter the family business. But Hunt's artistic talent was spotted while he was still quite young, working as a clerk at the age of 12. It was spotted by his employer, and at that time he took up oil painting, initially as a hobby. He eventually entered the Royal Academy as a student after a number of failed attempts in 1844 and against his family's wishes. But he was ambivalent about the Royal Academy right from the beginning, complaining of the drabness of much of the exhibits in that institution and across art galleries at the time, noting that they were mainly brown in colour and describing them as drab. And he rapidly rejected many of the values of the Royal Academy, having a particular dislike for the work of Joshua Reynolds, the school's founder, who was referred disparagingly to by Hunt and his set as Sir Sloshua. Hunt's thinking at this time was deeply influenced by his reading of John Ruskin's Modern Painters 2, which was published in 1846, so 2 years after he entered the Royal Academy. And it was also influenced by his developing friendship with John Everett Millais and Dante Gabriel Rossetti, with whom he founded the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood in 1848. That being a culmination of a period of reaction against Victorian ideas of high art enshrined in those conventions of the Royal Academy. Hunt was a lifelong friend of John Ruskin, who was his senior by 8 years. Ruskin sometimes acted as Hunt's champion, but also as his critic. John Everett Millais' famous portrait of Ruskin, which you can see in the Ashmolean Museum here in Oxford, is on the left of the slide. And the photograph on the right is of Hunt and Ruskin in later life, Ruskin on the left and Hunt on the right, when Ruskin was living essentially as a recluse at his home in the Lake District. The two of them shared a deeply Protestant evangelical Christian faith that they had grown up with since childhood. Both were very familiar with the Bible, and Ruskin recalled how, as a child, he used to play at preaching, standing on a chair and saying, "People, be good." Hunt is said to have spent much of his childhood reading the Bible. But this faith was coming under a good deal of pressure. Firstly, from theories of gradual evolution that were beginning to challenge the Genesis creation account, forerunners of Darwin, based on the geological and paleontological record. Ruskin himself, who was a keen geologist, famously said, "If only the geologists would let me alone, I could do very well. But those dreadful hammers, I hear the clink of them at the end of every cadence of the Bible verses." The second pressure on this relatively simple evangelical faith came from historical, critical, biblical scholarship, especially regarding the person of Jesus of Nazareth, who is central to evangelical Christian piety. Liberal Protestant biblical scholarship of the Tübingen School was being disseminated more widely. At that time, David Friedrich Strauss's Das Leben Jesu had become available in English translation by George Eliot in 1846. Hunt read it and was deeply challenged by its demythologizing agenda. He also appears to have read Feuerbach's Das Wesen des Christentums, also in a translation by Eliot of 1841. And a final pressure for Protestant Anglicans was of a more political perceived threat from the Roman Catholic Church, whose hierarchy was restored in England some years later, in 1850, under Cardinal Wiseman. This was seen as essentially a distinct faith tradition, rife with superstition and essentially perceived as foreign. Ruskin, and initially Hunt as well, were highly suspicious of the Oxford movement within Anglicanism that had, to their minds, been Romanizing the Church of England since the 1830s. And so Ruskin's comment that begins with the hammers of the geologists ends with the Oxford movement. If only the geologists would let me alone, I could do very well. But those dreadful hammers, I hear the clink of them at the end of every cadence of the Bible verses, and on the other side, these unhappy, blinking Puseyisms, men trying to do right and losing their very humanity. This painting by Hunt of 1852, The Hireling Shepherd, refers to Jesus' discourse on the Good Shepherd in John's Gospel. It's full of symbolism and influenced by a recently published essay of Ruskin's. It's presented as a warning to the established Anglican Church against the danger of its preoccupation with its inner factions, its flirting with popish superstitions on the one hand, with liberal enlightened secularism on another, and fundamentalist Protestant sectarianism on yet another, with the result that it allegedly neglected its flock. So, for example, in this painting, the underripe apples of half-baked teaching will kill the lamb on the woman's lap, and the death head's moth that is distracting the man from his job signifies superstitious ritual. This is an anxious painting dominated by threat. And I'm showing you it because it illustrates the features of pre-Raphaelitism that had emerged from the group's reading of modern painters too and become their basic principles. Precise representation of humble objects, the use of colour rather than shadow, careful composition that nevertheless abandons classic rules of perspective, giving a rather flat appearance, and especially for Hunt, symbolic realism. This offers a key to interpretation that enables the attentive and biblically literate viewer to detect meaning in the painting through natural intuition. It rests on the assumption that there's a resonance or an analogy between the material world and eternal transcendent truths. An analogy that human beings have an inbuilt capacity to decode. And this approach connected strongly with contemporary evangelical typological approaches to biblical exegesis. The capacity of one thing to signify another is held to arise from a natural connection divinely built into the structure of reality and therefore potentially evident to everyone, rather than a secret system of arbitrary signification that is determined by an artistic or a religious elite. At the same time that he was painting that picture, Hunt was beginning work on the light of the world, which is the topic of this presentation. He'd undergone a kind of artistic conversion in reading modern painters too, and he says of it, something first arrested me in my downward course. It was the voice of God. I read this in rapture, and it sowed some seed of shame. But Hunt also seems to have been struggling with the challenge of his faith, posed by his reading of biblical scholarship and of Feuerbach that I mentioned just before. And in a much later letter to William Bell Scott, he recounts this struggle. He says, I had myself been much in want of some certainty as to whether there is a master. I set out to read the Bible critically in great anxiety because I wanted neither to accept contemporary skepticism nor yet to be hoodwinked by desire into belief. I came upon Revelation 3:20, Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man hear my voice and open the door, I will come into him and will sup with him and he with me. The figure of Christ standing at the door haunted me, gradually coming more clearly defined in meaning, with logical enrichments, waiting in the night, ever night, near the dawn, with a light sheltered from the chance of extinction. So Hunt emerged from this period of turmoil with an intensified faith in Christ and a renewed sense of vocation as an artist. And he gives varied accounts of the overall process, but it does appear that he underwent some mystical and even paranormal experiences. And I have speculated about the insistent knocking of Christ that might perhaps have performed a counterpoint to the ringing of Ruskin's dreadful hammers. And the command, behold, is not so far removed from Ruskin's constant instruction to the reader to look properly in Modern Painters 2, described, as I've said, by Hunt as the voice of God. So on the slide are some of Hunt's preparatory sketches for the painting. These are photographs that I took myself in a recent Ashmolean exhibition. And again, they're kept in the Ashmolean Museum here in Oxford. So here is Hunt's picture, which he painted, first of all, the background and the general composition by moonlight, staying up all night from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. the following morning across the month of November 1851 in the orchard of the home he was living at the time in Worcester Park Farm. He used the door of an abandoned shed that he'd come across as a model for the door. So this is a quintessentially English setting. The figure was painted in Hunt's London studio the next year, 1852, and he used phosphorescent light to replicate the sense of the moonlight. And last of all, he painted in the details of the flora. The process was interrupted by Hunt having to finish the Hireling Shepherd, and then it was resumed in 1853. And the background conforms to Pre-Raphaelite principles. It's marked by detailed depiction of nature and symbolic realism. And perhaps the most subtle and clever example being the halo-like moon behind Jesus' head. Hunt took similar trouble with realistic details of the drapery of the body, but he wanted the face of Christ to be what he described as mystical. And so to do that, he used his memory of several different people that he knew. So he formed a composite. These people were both men and women. And this is perhaps the first indication of the stretching of some boundaries. This is a mystical painting and it reflects Hunt's spiritual experiences at that time. Hunt offered no explanation of the painting beyond inscribing the text from Revelation on the frame, so you can just make it out in this slide here on the right. The title is taken from a verse in John's Gospel. I am the light of the world. He that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life. And again, despite its English domestic setting, there is a suggestion of expanding boundaries in this title. Christ is presented not as the light of the English Church or even the British Empire, but of the world. Here you can see that frame and the picture in situ in Keble College, which was bequeathed it by its original owner, Thomas Combe, in 1895. And it's important to note that Combe was from the Oxford movement, the Catholic end of Anglicanism, and he started to become a strong influence on Hunt and contributed to the broadening of Hunt's ideas. There was an opening to the beauty and mysticism of high Anglicanism, evident in embryonic form, even in this painting. It was exhibited in the Royal Academy in 1854. And it got a cool response. People didn't quite know what to make of it. They found the juxtaposition of the ordinary setting with the exalted topic jarring. And so Ruskin stepped in to defend it. I'm just going to read some extracts from his famous letter to the Times of the 5th of May, 1854. It's a long letter, so I'll read just part of it. Sir, I trust that with your usual kindness and liberality, you will give me room in your columns for a few words respecting the principal Pre-Raphaelite picture in the exhibition of the Royal Academy this year. Its painter is travelling in the Holy Land and can neither suffer nor benefit by criticism, but I am solicitous that justice should be done to this work, not for his sake, but for that of the large number of persons who during the year will have an opportunity of seeing it, and on whom, if rightly understood, it may make an impression for which they will ever afterwards be grateful. I speak of the picture called The Light of the World by Mr. Holman Hunt. Standing by it yesterday for upwards of an hour, I watched the effect it produced upon the passers-by. Few stopped to look at it, and those who did, almost invariably with some contemptuous expression, founded on what appeared to them the absurdity of representing the Saviour with a lantern in his hand. Then Ruskin goes on to explain some of the symbolism as he understood it. On the left-hand side of the picture is seen this door of the human soul. It is fast barred. Its bars and nails are rusty. It is knitted and bound in its stanchions by creeping tendrils of ivy, showing that it has never been opened. A bat hovers about it. Its threshold is overgrown with brambles, nettles, and fruitless corn. Christ approaches it in the night time. Christ in his everlasting offices of prophet, priest, and king. He wears the white robe representing the power of the Spirit upon him, the jewelled robe and breastplate representing the sacerdotal investiture, the rayed crown of gold, inwoven with a crown of thorns, not dead thorns, but now bearing soft leaves for the healing of the nations. For my own part, I think it one of the very noblest works of sacred art ever produced in this or any other age. And this turned the fortunes of the picture around. However, the historian Thomas Carlyle, whom Hunt greatly admired and was in fact one of the unwitting models for the face of Christ, he was not so generous. Carlyle, who had written extensively on the concept of the hero figure and favoured a form of muscular Christianity, seemed to be disturbed by the effeminate appearance of Christ and what he took to be the Roman Catholic vestments in which he was attired. He said, and this is Hunt's account, "You call that thing, I ween, a picture of Jesus Christ. Now you cannot gain any profit for yourself, except in mere pecuniary sense, or profit anyone else on earth, in putting into shape a mere papistical fantasy like that, for it can only be an inanity, or a delusion to everyone that may look on it. It is a poor, misshaped presentation of the noblest, the brotherliest, and the most heroic-minded being that ever walked God's earth." And he went on to compare Hunt to Judas in betraying Christ in the painting. But Carlyle's interpretation was mistaken, certainly with respect to the what he took to be Roman Catholic vestments. For the rectangular clasp that fastens Jesus' vestments doesn't depict Catholic dress, but it's the clasp of the Jewish high priest. And it was based on a reconstruction of Aaron's breastplate from a pictorial Bible owned by Hunt, which he often referred to. Much later, Hunt explained that the clasp contained the mystic Urim, interestingly the lights, and the Tumim, in which 12 stones signify the tribes of Israel. And in some recent research of my own, I came across this extract from the Hellenistic Jew Philo of Alexandria's Life of Moses, in which he writes, "Such then are the figurative meanings which he desires to indicate by the sacred vestments of the high priest, the 12 stones arranged on the breast in 4 rows of 3 stones each, being also an emblem of that reason which holds together and regulates the universe." So here there is, to my mind anyway, a fascinating link between the priestly cult and the upholding of the universe by God, something brought together for Christians in Christ, but more broadly, a link between these cultic vestments and the natural world in which Hunt has set them. And the painting becomes more coherent then than it first appears. Furthermore, the circular part of the clasp was drawn from vestments of non-Jewish faiths, referred to by a contemporary commentator as heathen, or what we might call indigenous. So there appears to be a bringing together on Christ's breast of at least some pre-Christian faiths, Jewish and non-Jewish, and depicted for the whole world. Furthermore, the details of the lantern that are seen here in a sketch for a brass model that Hunt had made include the Star of David. You will have noticed that in his letter to the Times, John Ruskin mentions that Hunt has departed for the Holy Land, which covered Israel, Palestine, and parts of Syria broadly. And it seems that his concern with Jesus and Judaism was drawing Hunt towards the Bible lands. There is a precise parallel here with the quest for the historical Jesus, which had revived at this time due to archaeological finds and new manuscript evidence. And there was an emerging awareness among European Christians that Jesus was actually a Jew, and that to understand him properly, one needed to understand his culture. This painting, which is now in Birmingham City Art Gallery, occupied Hunt for the next 6 years, on and off. It's called The Finding of the Saviour in the Temple, and it's based on the incident in Luke chapter 2, when the 12-year-old Jesus is found by his parents in his father's house. There's lots of questions one could ask about the nature of finding in this painting. But I just want to note a couple of facts. One is the setting is a long way from the English orchard of the light of the world. This is a very different kind of painting. It was meticulously reconstructed from archaeological sources. Hunt studied the Talmudim to familiarize himself with contemporary liturgical practices. He used some local Jewish models, but because of resistance from the religious authorities, he was forced to supplement these with British Jews on his return, including a North London Ashkenazi family for Jesus and his parents. This was a daring and controversial progressive move at the time, though to our eyes, the depiction of Judaism may appear stereotypical or pejorative. The painting again is full of symbolism, much of it focusing on vision and blindness and the nature of borders, the question who is in and who is out. And it's clearly a step on a journey. 30 years later, Hunt returned to the topic with the painting Christ Among the Doctors, minus the Jewish caricatures and with a much more open dialogical composition. This Christ is no longer heroic, but he's reflected and he's situated in the midst of his culture. Now, at the same time all of this was happening, Ernst Renan was writing his controversial Vie de Jésus, a book which emphasized Jesus' humanity as a historical figure firmly located in first century Palestinian Judaism. And after reading this, Hunt was prompted to begin work on what many critics considered his masterpiece, The Shadow of Death. This picture hangs in Manchester City Art Gallery. Hunt was able to complete a small version of this in Bethlehem in 1870, despite, along with his poor Jewish models, experiencing extreme heat and extreme cold. But the aspect of this painting that is most relevant to the theme that we're considering this evening is on the bottom left. Mary, the mother of Jesus, is opening a chest which contains the gifts of the Magi that she had treasured since Christ's birth. The Magi were figures of wisdom who came from beyond the limits of Judaism, guided to Christ by a natural phenomenon available to all, with the eyes to see it, the night sky. All through this period, from around 1855 to 1870, Hunt spent much time in the Holy Land, aiming to depict the landscape almost as a natural historian and pressing into uncharted territory. An example of this is the region of Kabel Uzdum by the Dead Sea, which forms the backdrop to this painting, Scapegoat. This was an inaccessible and inhospitable place of which no photographs yet existed. So people were very grateful to this painting purely for the geographic details that it offered them. Hunt made much of the dangers from natural conditions, but also from local bandits that were faced by himself and his guides on these expeditions. On the left is a publicity photograph reconstructing his arrangements for painting in these regions, armed with both paintbrush and gun. And on the right, a photograph of him in the Eastern garb that he was increasingly embracing. Hunt, like many of his British contemporaries, was caught up in the cultural phenomenon of Orientalism, something that with hindsight has been understood as a kind of illusory projection of empire. He found Orientalism exotic and enchanting, as this extract from one of his letters illustrates. I've just returned from a walk around the town, this is Cairo. You see the crowd gliding past, composed of Arab, Jew, Copt, Turk, Greek, and Frank. Here are others also in plenty, Nubian and Abyssinian with Syrian and Persian. Now the crowd is burst open by a party of 8 or 10 ladies, all in the charge of a eunuch. Heaven shows a blue sky tonight, such as no northern dreamer could conceive. And there are stars of coloured lamps hanging between us and these minarets, and mosque domes rising in the pearly moonlight over the city gates in front. Now 4 Mecca men are stalking, bedecked with tassels, which hang about them like the trappings of a princess's choicest horse. And as they pass by, 2 separate women in white mummy dresses slide by like ghosts. And following these, Fellah girls and Cairene damsels in blue, and then Greeks in smart jackets and starched short pettiskirts, Bedouins in striped blankets thrown about them as Caesar would have handled the world. Arnaut soldier in frank undercoats and monk-like overcoats carrying guns with barrels and locks made to look pretty as silver, and townsmen, green turbaned, red turbaned and white turbaned, some white as the smoke of hashish, shuffling along in loose slippers, pipe in hand. So Hunt is clearly entranced by this and paints many aspects of it. And yes, his description objectivies the scene, somewhat like a tourist. It's clear that his horizons, his ideas of the world, of which Christ is claimed to be the light, were diversifying and expanding. But back to the light of the world. It has become ubiquitous in various guises across the globe, in churches, in art galleries. So a second version painted for Manchester City Art Gallery in 1853 is in the centre of that slide. There's another image from a cushion that you can buy on the internet on there from today. An image from a church in Tenerife, and a stained glass window from a church in Toronto, but also for personal devotion in Protestant households. So that one on the bottom left would be an example of that, whose culture had until then been largely deprived of religious visual images. And it had a significant afterlife, nearly 50 years after it first appeared. Hunt was asked to produce a new version of the painting, specifically for a tour of the British Empire in 1905. He readily agreed, and here he is at work on it, though as he was now quite elderly, much was executed by an assistant. And this massive version of the painting now hangs in St. Paul's Cathedral. It differs from the original in a number of respects, most of them fairly subtle. The most interesting difference was noted by a contemporary writing in the Times. So the picture on the left is the original lantern, and the right is the lantern in the later St. Paul's picture. This correspondent writes, "There is one strange addition which the artist seems to have made as a rebuke to the Keble authorities, who are suspected of thinking the original too liberal in meaning. On the new lantern, you may see painted the crescent and the star, as though to show that, in the painter's thought, the divine message is for all the world, for Mohammedan as for Christian." And hopefully you can make out that difference in the image on the right. What are we to make of this? It occurs in the context of a tour with a highly imperialist agenda with which Hunt readily and openly colluded. But it's not clear to me that the expansiveness of his religious vision can simply be reduced to British imperialism. The tour, which went on between 1905 and 1907, happened in the immediate aftermath of the Boer War, when the identity of the empire was in a state of transition and in perceived need of consolidation. This is a map of the itinerary. The whole thing, including the curator guide and postcards and prints for sale at each stop, was orchestrated by the London art dealer, Ernest Gambart, who had purchased the copyrights to prints and reproductions back in 1856. And it was facilitated by the shipping magnate, William Booth. The idea was to send the painting to all the white settler colonies, leaving South Africa until last in order to minimize risks and maximize propaganda value. There were a number of ideas in the mix. One was the need for allegedly culturally deprived British colonials to be enriched by an iconic artifact from the heart of the empire. Another was the need to promote British art, which was in danger of being eclipsed by American Impressionism and the French avant-garde movement at the time. And yet another was to offer an elevating vision of the national ideal across the empire. Hunt himself wrote in this context, "To whom but the artist is relegated the task of giving a tangible and worthy image of the national body and mind, who else may select and uphold the invisible sign of that beauty in his race, which is the most heroic physically and mentally?" The colonials, both critics and public, who were on the receiving end of this, responded in varied ways, depending on their local political context. Canadians gave a largely negative response. The Australian public flocked to it, but its critics dismissed it on both political and aesthetic grounds. The New Zealanders took a contrary approach to the Australians, apparently on principle, and the South African response was overwhelmingly positive. So is the universalist iconography in the final version of the Light of the World, most of which is already there even in 1854, simply a religious gloss to an imperialist enterprise of civilizing the whole world with the enlightenment of a white English Christ. Matthew Potter has posed the question of whether Hunt's apparently benign naturalism is simply nationalism in disguise. The arts scholar Nancy Davenport argues that this is too simple a conclusion, describing Hunt's beliefs, like his repeated versions of his paintings, as layered. She notes the way that his extensive travels brought him into contact with urban and agrarian Jews, Christians and Muslims, and with the officials in the Anglican, Byzantine and Lutheran churches. This made him a passionate advocate of a peaceful solution to factions in the Middle East through a merging of all monotheistic faiths, initially Christianity and Judaism, but later showing an openness to Islam as well. He was a vocal opponent of anti-Semitism, especially in its institutional forms, singling out Germany and Russia for criticism in that respect. Like us today, he lived and painted in a cultural context marked by rapid change, increased information flow, and conflicting norms. But like the Christ in his painting, his work invites the viewer to open the door of the mind and to behold. Thank you.
Thank you so very, very much, Joanna, for a very, very rich presentation. I have a couple of questions that I, throw out in your direction of two that are completely different. The simple art historical one is, I was reminded, because he did two slightly different versions at quite some time apart from each other, of Leonardo's handling of the Virgin and St. Anne, two versions also done separately. One ends up in the Louvre, the other in England. Whether there is a kind of analogous significance, is it rethinking, or is it just, decades later, it just details come out differently? That's one question. Do you want me to wait for the second question?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a long answer to your question. I think I was very aware that this is a habit of Hunt's. He repaints most of his paintings at least once, if not more. He's so cerebral. I think it's a rethinking. But I think I've only just noticed that as I was preparing this talk. He's actually doing the work, as a writer does the work of thinking when they write. He's rethinking his beliefs as he paints.
I like that. So here's my second question, which is both cerebral and trans-cerebral, because it's the question of mysticism, because of your very astute reflections on it as a kind of mystical work. So I was thinking, we've got Christ knocking on the door. There's no doorknob outside, so it's left to the individuals on the inside to open that door. And that might be implied by the passage from Revelation that this alludes to. But then I thought, in the mystical enterprise, the mystic is knocking on the door, hoping to get into the innermost recesses of God. And then I thought, and on the third hand, of course, Christ is unique in being both God and human. So the mystic hopes to become one with God. Christ is actually, and therefore in Christian mysticism in particular, the sort of solution to that problem. How do I become one with God? Because he is. So he is both representing us trying to get there and God trying to get to us. Just wondering what you...
He comes out, it seems to, anyway, Hunt's description of this process is written many years later, so it's difficult to know absolutely how accurate it was, but he seems to come out of precisely what you've described in Hunt's own life. But as you were saying that, I was thinking of another verse from John's Gospel where Jesus says, I am the door. So you could there's a lot of play that you could make already with that verse. I mean, there's the image of the knocking. There's the first word, behold. you know, which you could translate, means attend, but you could translate listen, or you could translate look, but you can't look without a light. So the whole thing is kind of suggesting some kind of interchange, I think.
Yes.
But there is something about opening the door that's quite important. And I'm very interested in the idea of opening the door and then opening the mind, which also seems to be going on for Hunt in the process of doing the painting.
And then I think back, again, given his sort of scholarly inclinations, to the Song of Songs, right?
Yeah.
My beloved being a closed garden until the prince shall come to open the gate or open the door, that in standard issue Christianity and Christian art becomes, you know, the Virgin, who is not the Virgin of the Song of Songs, but the Virgin Mary herself. And God is the one who opens the door, who is Christ. You know, whether how much he's playing on that as well.
It may be there in the background. It may be there. He has such a mix of influences on him. And I think they change with the later version of the painting anyway. I think he's still a deeply individualist evangelical at the beginning, maybe starting to shift. There's something about being invited to open the door that's really important. So that's kind of maybe more Annunciation-like than Song of Songs-like, although I agree that door imagery is very strong in Song of Songs.
Yes. And I hope that you will join the Oxford Interfaith Forum precisely a month from now on February 9th, when we shift gears from the visual to the musical arts, and from a primarily Christian to a primarily Muslim context, because the February 9th session with Reverend Dr. Eric Sarwar will be devoted to the art of sacred sound in the Muslim context, Psalms and Islam. And it promises to be as exciting and interesting as this afternoon or this evening's session was. Thank you all very much for participating. And again, thank you so much to Dr. Joanna Collicutt for enlightening, entertaining, and enriching us so effectively. Thank you all.